The moment was electric, though not in the way Mike Pompeo had hoped. He leaned forward, his voice sharpened like a blade, cutting through the chamber with a condescension honed over years in power. "Congresswoman Crockett," he sneered, his tone dripping with disdain. "Your record is paper-thin. You're a rookie hiding behind slogans, not substance. You wouldn't last a day in the real arena of leadership." The words landed with an arrogance so thick you could almost feel it crawling along the walls. The room shifted. Lawmakers, staffers, and press all froze in that suspended instant between insult and reply. Some smirked, waiting for Crockett to wither under the blow. Others turned their eyes to her with quiet hope. Could she stand tall against one of Washington's most practiced political predators? Even the cameras seemed to lean in closer, hungry for the fallout. Pompeo sat back, with the smug certainty of a man convinced he had already won. His supporters in the corner exchanged knowing glances, as if they were watching a seasoned gladiator dispatch a newcomer in the arena. The arrogance was palpable. But then, silence. Crockett didn't flinch. Her eyes locked on Pompeo's, not with anger but with a steadiness that seemed to drain the confidence from his words. She didn't rush to fill the silence. She let it linger, let it press down on the room until even Pompeo began to fidget ever so slightly in his chair. Every great story begins with an imbalance, a towering Goliath convinced of his own invincibility, and a David whose sling has yet to be revealed. This was that moment. The air thickened with anticipation. Viewers at home, millions watching live, felt it too. Social feeds began to crackle, clips of Pompeo's barb spreading before the dust had even settled. The internet had already chosen its villain. But the hero's move had not yet been played, because what came next was not what anyone in that room, not the press, not Pompeo, not even the spectators leaning over the rail, expected. Crockett's response would not only dismantle Pompeo's smug attack, it would reverberate far beyond those four walls. And as the silence stretched, as all eyes fixed on the Congresswoman from Texas, one truth became undeniable. The next words out of her mouth would leave a former Secretary of State stunned, silent, and exposed for the world to see. Pompeo's attack hadn't erupted out of nowhere. It was calculated, the kind of strike crafted long before the cameras switched on. For months, Crockett had been a rising presence, outspoken, unapologetic, and deeply resonant with communities often ignored in the corridors of power. Her voice carried a weight that made establishment figures uncomfortable. To Pompeo, a man who had navigated the highest offices with an iron jaw and a dismissive smirk, this was intolerable. He wasn't about to let a freshman congresswoman steal the spotlight, especially not one who represented everything he dismissed as fringe. And so, when the opportunity presented itself, he pounced. He saw the moment as an easy win, a chance, to reinforce his dominance by ridiculing the so-called newcomer. After all, this was his turf: blunt attacks, forceful presence, and an audience that expected him to crush opposition with sheer confidence. Pompeo, the seasoned operator, expected Crockett to stumble, to shrink under the magnitude of his challenge. In his mind, this wasn't a fair fight. It was a show of strength. But Crockett's very presence was a contradiction to that expectation. She wasn't the rookie he painted her to be. Behind the label of outsider was a seasoned fighter who had clawed her way from grassroots advocacy into the halls of Congress. Her career as a public defender had taught her the art of resilience. She had faced down tougher rooms than this: hostile judges, juries ready to dismiss her clients, systems built to silence voices like hers. And each time she had found a way to cut through, to be heard, to stand her ground. Still, in the cloistered world of Washington elites, perception carried more weight than reality. To many in the chamber, Crockett was untested, a voice too new to withstand the verbal barrage of a heavyweight like Pompeo. That perception was Pompeo's greatest weapon. He didn't need facts on his side, he only needed to project superiority. And on that day, when he delivered his venom-laced lines, he believed he had already won the battle before it began. What he hadn't accounted for was the shift happening beneath the surface. Crockett represented more than herself. She represented a new generation of leaders who carried with them the urgency of lived experience. For every sneer Pompeo delivered, there were millions watching who recognized themselves in her calm silence. For every dismissive glance, there were families who knew the sting of being underestimated, written off, ignored. Pompeo's arrogance was not just a miscalculation, it was a trap he had set for himself. Because in underestimating Crockett, he underestimated the country that had placed her there, the people who saw in her a reflection of their own dignity and determination. The chamber sat suspended in that imbalance, a towering veteran convinced of his victory, and a freshman, quiet, deliberate, ready to strike with something far more devastating than bluster. The buildup had reached its peak. Pompeo thought he had staged the perfect takedown, but in truth, he had prepared the perfect stage for his own undoing. And as Crockett drew a steady breath, her eyes locked on his with a fire he hadn't anticipated. One truth became undeniable. Pompeo had no idea the trap he'd walked into. Mike Pompeo's story is one steeped in power, ambition, and the kind of unflinching self-confidence that can border on arrogance. He carved his way into the American political stage as a man who demanded to be taken seriously, projecting toughness at every turn. From his early days in Kansas politics to his rise as CIA director and later Secretary of State, Pompeo thrived on the image of a hawk, blunt, unapologetic, unyielding. He wanted to be seen not just as a public servant, but as a power broker, someone who could bend the world toward his vision. But beneath the polished titles and the hard-edged demeanor lay contradictions that followed him at every step. He preached loyalty, but was quick to discard allies when expedient. He championed American values abroad while cozying up to authoritarian strongmen when it suited political goals. He framed himself as a defender of truth, yet earned a reputation for dodging transparency and dismissing criticism with a sneer. The louder he spoke, the more fragile his case became. Pompeo's tenure in government was marked by sharp rhetoric and sharp elbows. At the CIA, he was known for demanding loyalty above all else, operating with a suspicion that bordered on paranoia. As Secretary of State, he often delivered fiery speeches about freedom while dismissing journalists, belittling dissenters, and brushing off accountability. His words carried the weight of authority, but also the stench of hubris. To critics, he embodied the arrogance of power unchecked. To his supporters, he was a fighter unafraid to tell it like it is, and yet contradictions clung to him. He spoke of moral clarity, but blurred lines whenever it was politically convenient. He insisted America was respected under his watch, even as diplomats quietly lamented the erosion of trust with allies. He projected unshakable confidence while carrying the scars of controversies, decisions that drew lawsuits, investigations, and international backlash. For Pompeo, image was everything, and image required volume. That very volume became both his shield and his weakness. The louder he thundered, the more he signaled his need to dominate, to silence opposition rather than engage with it. He relied on force, not persuasion. He leaned on arrogance, not empathy. And in that reliance, he revealed a vulnerability, the inability to withstand calm, composed resistance. So when Pompeo turned his sights on Jasmine Crockett, he brought the full weight of that persona into the chamber. He was certain that volume would drown her out, that arrogance would intimidate, that dismissiveness would belittle her into silence. It was the same formula he had used for years against journalists, critics, and opponents who lacked his platform. But this time was different. Crockett was not playing by his rules, and the world watching had grown tired of the old script. They saw through the contradictions. They saw through the bluster. They saw a man who wielded arrogance as a weapon, unaware. That it had dulled with overuse. The foreshadowing was clear. The stage he had built for his attack was also the stage where his contradictions would collapse. His dismissiveness would not go unanswered, his arrogance would not pass unchecked, and the moment he underestimated Crockett, he sealed the trajectory of what was to come. Because the truth about Pompeo was this: the louder he spoke, the more fragile his case became. And in the silence that followed his attack, that fragility was about to be exposed in full. Jasmine Crockett's story does not begin in the gleaming marble halls of Washington, nor in the polished echo chambers of elite politics. It begins in Texas, in the grit of working-class neighborhoods where opportunity was scarce. But determination ran deep. From an early age, she learned what it meant to be underestimated. She knew the sting of being told she didn't belong, of being dismissed, before her voice was even heard. Those lessons hardened into steel. Her upbringing was not gilded, but it was rich in the values that would define her path: dignity, resilience, and an unshakable sense of justice. She grew up in a world that tested her, a world where she had to fight for every inch of space she claimed. That fight didn't make her bitter. It made her authentic. It gave her a perspective that would resonate with millions who saw themselves reflected in her journey. When she chose the law, she wasn't chasing prestige. She chose the courtroom because it was the front line in the battle for fairness. As a public defender, Crockett stood shoulder to shoulder with those society cast aside, giving them not just legal counsel, but a voice. She faced judges who doubted her, prosecutors who dismissed her, systems that seemed designed to break the people she represented, and still she showed up, case after case, armed with nothing more than her preparation, her persistence, and her refusal to back down. These years forged her. They were not glamorous, but they were defining. She saw up close the inequities of the justice system, the way power tilted the scales, the way arrogance tried to pass itself off as truth. It was in these battles that Crockett learned to hold her ground against overwhelming odds. It was in these battles that she developed the calm fire that now carried her into the national stage. Her leap into politics was not the pursuit of personal ambition, but an extension of service. Constituents who had watched her fight in the courts knew she could fight in the legislature. They rallied behind her not because she was polished, but because she was real. They didn't see a career politician, they saw one of their own. They saw a woman who carried their struggles, their pride, their frustrations, and their hopes with her every step. And so when Crockett walked into Congress, she didn't arrive with the entitlement of legacy. She arrived with the weight of sacrifice. She arrived carrying the stories of the overlooked, the immigrants who worked twice as hard for half the recognition, the families who stitched together dignity out of resilience. That authenticity radiated from her. Even when opponents tried to brand her as rookie, the people who knew her story saw something else entirely: a fighter. What makes Crockett's journey powerful is not perfection, but perseverance. She has stumbled, she has struggled, she has faced doors slammed in her face, but each setback only sharpened her resolve. Each dismissal only deepened her hunger to prove that dignity cannot be erased by arrogance, and truth cannot be drowned out by volume. By the time she sat across from Pompeo, her life had already been 1,000 smaller battles of underestimation. Each one had prepared her for this moment. Pompeo's words may have cut with practiced arrogance, but Crockett carried scars far deeper, scars that had turned into armor. And unlike Pompeo, her strength was not rooted in dominance or ego. It was rooted in service, in authenticity, in the quiet conviction that her voice was not hers alone but carried the weight of many. As she steadied herself against his attack, it was not just Jasmine Crockett in that chamber. It was every person who had been written off as too young, too inexperienced, too unworthy. It was every immigrant child told they'd never measure up, every woman dismissed as emotional, every underdog who had been forced to fight twice as hard to stand on equal ground, and it was in that moment that her journey crystallized into destiny. All the courtroom battles, all the slammed doors, all the underestimated moments had led here. She had been underestimated before, and each time she had risen. This time would be no different, because those same battles gave her the fire for this very moment. Pompeo wasn't finished. The initial strike had landed with all the subtlety of a hammer, and now he pressed forward, layering insult upon insult, hoping to bury Crockett beneath the sheer weight of his confidence. His voice grew louder, his gestures sharper. Your record is thin. Your experience is shallow. You parade around with slogans instead of solutions, he fired, leaning across the desk with a smirk that suggested certainty of victory. Each barb was delivered not just for Crockett, but for the cameras. For the audience at home, he assumed would nod along with his performance. But the more he spoke, the more the chamber shifted. Lawmakers who had been nodding began to glance uneasily at one another. The press gallery leaned forward, sensing that something was building. Viewers watching at home could see it too, not just the content of his words, but the desperation beneath them. And then there was Crockett. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't interrupt. She sat steady, shoulders square, her gaze unwavering. Where Pompeo's movements were restless, hers were still. Where his tone escalated, hers was silence, an unspoken refusal to be rattled. That steadiness became louder than his bluster, each second of composure eroding the power of his words. Pompeo mistook her silence for weakness. He leaned in harder. You think your slogans will save you from scrutiny? You think fiery speeches can replace the years it takes to lead? This isn't a courtroom, Congresswoman. This is the real world. And in the real world, you're out of your depth. He punctuated the line with a dismissive wave of his hand, as though swatting away a fly. But the audience didn't see weakness. They saw endurance. They saw a woman standing tall against the storm, refusing to break. The cameras lingered on her calm expression, the very image of restraint. In contrast, Pompeo's face was flushed, his hands restless, his tone increasingly clipped. The imbalance of energy was unmistakable. One was unraveling, the other was quietly sharpening her blade. Whispers rippled through the chamber. Some smirked. Nervously, others exchanged wide-eyed glances. The tension was no longer about whether Crockett could withstand the attack. It was about how long she would wait before striking back. Pompeo, in his arrogance, had transformed the room into an audience primed for her reply. Every insult he hurled only tightened the spring. Every dismissive remark only fed the anticipation. Crockett's silence was no longer passive. It was active, deliberate. The kind of silence that bends the energy of a room and forces everyone to lean closer. Even those loyal to Pompeo felt it, the sense that something was about to break. And in that mounting pressure, the dynamic shifted. Pompeo thought he was cornering her, but in reality, he was cornering himself, building the perfect stage for a counterstrike he could not defend against. His voice rose once more, his finger stabbing the air. You're not ready for this seat. You're not ready for this fight. The chamber froze. Crockett blinked once, slowly, still unshaken. The silence stretched again, heavy, expectant. The air seemed to crackle with suspense. Every insult had brought her closer. Every moment of arrogance had only set the trap tighter. And now, as Pompeo's words still echoed faintly off the chamber walls, Jasmine Crockett was ready, because every insult brought her closer to the counterstrike. The silence was unbearable. Pompeo's final jab still lingered in the air, a challenge, hanging between them. But instead of rushing to defend herself, Jasmine Crockett leaned back ever so slightly, letting the pause grow long enough to make the entire chamber lean in. That pause was her opening move, deliberate, surgical. Then she spoke. Mr. Pompeo, she began, her tone even, her words measured. You've had decades to prove what leadership looks like. And yet here we are. The room shifted. Heads turned. The faint scribbling of reporters' pens scratched in rapid rhythm. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried, calm against the storm he had tried to summon. She paused again, letting the words breathe, her gaze locked on him. Then came the reveal. You call my record thin, but let's compare. When I fought in courtrooms to defend the most vulnerable, families, workers, people written off by a system rigged against them, where were you? I was standing with the people. You were cutting deals with the powerful. Gasps rippled. A few murmurs echoed across the chamber. Pompeo shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening. Crockett pressed forward, each fact another strike, each line another unmasking. You talk about experience. My experience is defending the Constitution, one case at a time, against those who thought they could steamroll ordinary Americans. Yours? It's leaving behind scandals, dodging accountability, and dismissing those who dare to question you. You've had power, yes. But tell me, what did you build with it except walls between yourself and the truth? The chamber erupted in low hums, half-audible reactions. Some leaned back, wide-eyed, as though they couldn't believe the rookie was dismantling the veteran with such precision. Pompeo tried to interject, but Crockett's calm tone cut across him like glass. You've called me a rookie, Mr. Pompeo. I'll wear that title proudly because it means I haven't been corrupted by decades of backroom politics. It means I still answer to the people who sent me here, not to my ego, not to my ambition, and not to the highest bidder. The crowd reacted audibly now. Scattered claps, murmurs of approval. A smile flickered at the corners of Crockett's mouth, not smug, but resolute. She let the sound ride for a moment, then lowered her voice just enough to make everyone strain to hear. You mistake my silence for weakness, but silence can be strength. While you were shouting, I was listening. While you were attacking, I was preparing. And while you underestimated me, you revealed yourself. Pompeo's smirk faltered. His eyes darted, his practiced mask of confidence cracking. For the first time, he seemed smaller, his volume unable to fill the room the way it had before. Crockett delivered the finishing blow with quiet precision. You say I'm not ready for this fight, but I've been fighting my entire life. Not for headlines, not for status, but for people who don't have the privilege of sitting in the seats we sit in. And that's the difference between us. You fight for yourself. I fight for them. The chamber broke. Applause swelled, hands clapped against desks, and the once heavy silence exploded into a roar of validation. Social media lit up instantly, hashtags flying as clips of her takedown spread like wildfire. Viewers at home could feel it in their bones. A moment of catharsis, a rookie turning the tables on a giant. Pompeo sat in stunned silence, his face a mask of forced composure. But the truth was plain. He had been silenced, undone by the very calm he mistook for weakness. The roar of the room eventually subsided, but the shift was permanent. Crockett had not just defended herself. She had redrawn the battlefield. She had shown that arrogance crumbles under dignity, that bluster cannot withstand truth spoken with conviction. And yet, even as the applause echoed, there lingered a sense that this moment was bigger than just a single exchange. The impact was about to ripple outward, through the media, through the public, through every corner of a country hungry for dignity over arrogance. What began as Pompeo's calculated attack had just transformed into Crockett's defining moment. But the world's reaction was still to come, because the silence in that chamber was only the beginning of the shockwaves about to hit everywhere else. The clip of Jasmine Crockett's takedown didn't just stay confined to the walls of that chamber. It detonated across the digital landscape. Within minutes, Twitter was ablaze. Hashtags like "Nice Crockett Clapback," Silence by Jasmine and Dignity over Arrogance surged into trending territory. Memes spread like wildfire. Screenshots of Pompeo's stunned expression paired with captions like, "When the rookie schools the veteran," or "That face when silence hits harder than speeches." On TikTok, creators stitched Crockett's calm, rebuke with music, turning her words into anthems layered over beat drops. Instagram Reels showcased her piercing lines, subtitled in bold fonts so no one could miss the sting. Facebook groups flooded with clips, shared by people who hadn't followed congressional hearings in years, but knew they had just witnessed something unforgettable. Cable networks seized the moment. The clip replayed on loop, pundits dissecting. Every pause, every glance, every syllable. Conservative commentators scrambled to spin it, insisting Pompeo had been restrained, while progressive voices hailed Crockett's performance as a masterclass in dignity. On late-night comedy shows, the exchange became monologue material. Pompeo's arrogance contrasted with Crockett's composed fire. But the most powerful reactions didn't come from politicians or celebrities. They came from ordinary Americans. Teachers wrote on social media about showing the clip to their students as an example of composure under pressure. Immigrant families reposted her words with pride, saying they felt seen in her defense of the overlooked. Young women messaged that they had goosebumps watching someone hold her ground so flawlessly. Veterans of grassroots activism recognized in her the fight they had carried for decades, now amplified on the national stage. The validation was overwhelming. It wasn't just about Pompeo versus Crockett anymore. It was about what the moment symbolized. It was about every underdog who had ever been told they were unqualified, every community dismissed as too small to matter, every dreamer silenced by arrogance. In Crockett's rebuttal, people saw the embodiment of their own resilience. And that was the real reason the clip spread so furiously. It wasn't just entertaining, it was empowering. It turned a hearing into a story, a clash into a parable, a political skirmish into a cultural milestone. Viewers didn't just consume it. They carried it, shared it, and lived it. Pompeo had entered the chamber convinced he was staging an easy win. But in the aftermath, it was clear. He had handed Crockett the microphone that would project her voice to millions. His arrogance had become her amplifier. Yet, as the memes multiplied and the applause poured in, a deeper question lingered. Beyond the viral headlines, beyond the hashtags and clips, what did this moment really mean? What truth had been revealed about power, about dignity, about the kind of leadership America was hungry for? Because beyond the viral moment lay a deeper lesson. When the echoes of applause faded and the viral whirlwind began to quiet, what remained was the heart of the moment, not the clash itself, but the principle it revealed. Jasmine Crockett had not simply defended herself, she had reframed the attack into a universal truth. Dignity always outshines arrogance. Her composure under fire was more than strategy. It was a lesson written in real time, one that resonated beyond politics. She showed that leadership isn't measured in volume or bravado, but in the ability to stay rooted in principle when challenged by power. Pompeo's voice had risen, but hers had held steady. And in that steadiness, the audience saw the difference between performance and authenticity. Crockett's words became more than rebuttals. They became reflections of a broader struggle, of truth against distortion, of service against self-interest, of resilience against dismissal. She reminded America that greatness does not come from belittling others, but from lifting up those who are overlooked. Her presence on that stage was proof that voices once silenced can now command a room, not with arrogance, but with quiet conviction. For immigrants, for working families, for young people doubting their place in the world, Crockett's stand became symbolic. She embodied the idea that the underestimated are not weak. They are simply waiting for their moment to be heard. Her fight was not just her own, it belonged to every person who had ever been told they didn't belong, every voice that had ever been drowned out by those in power. And this is where the lesson deepened. Arrogance can win the microphone for a moment, but dignity claims the story for generations. Arrogance seeks validation in domination. Dignity seeks strength in truth. Pompeo had leaned on the old playbook of dismissal, but Crockett wrote a new script, one where calm clarity became more powerful than 1,000 insults. The audience, both in that chamber and across the country, felt a surge of pride and vindication. They weren't just watching a political sparring match, they were watching the triumph of values they held dear: justice, perseverance, authenticity. Crockett's resilience became their own, her victory a mirror reflecting back their dignity. And in the end, this was the emotional crescendo. A reminder that no matter how loud arrogance roars, it can never drown out the steady, unshakable voice of truth. A reminder that America's story has always been written not by those who shouted the loudest, but by those who stood firm in the face of dismissal. This moment, born of confrontation, blossomed into something far larger, an affirmation that dignity is not just a shield, it is a weapon, not just a defense but a path forward. And as Crockett rose from that chamber, she carried more than her own pride. She carried the hopes of millions who believed once again that resilience could triumph, that authenticity could prevail, and that dignity would always rise above arrogance. Mike Pompeo had entered that chamber certain he would define the moment. But in the end, it was Jasmine Crockett who seized it, turning his attack into her defining breakthrough. What was meant to silence her became the very stage on which she showed the country who she was: calm, steady, unshaken, and armed with truth. This is why the clip spread far beyond politics. It wasn't just about two names clashing, it was about a universal story. Arrogance trying to smother dignity, only to be undone by it. Crockett didn't just defend herself, she proved that when arrogance shouts, dignity speaks louder, and that truth belongs to all of us. Each time we choose resilience over dismissal, service over ego, authenticity over performance, we continue the legacy of moments like this. Crockett's victory in that chamber is more than a viral highlight. It's a reminder of the values we want, reflected in our leaders and in ourselves. So here's the invitation. If you believe dignity always outshines arrogance, share this story. Let it ripple further. Let it remind others that calm truth can silence even the loudest arrogance. This isn't just a clip to watch. It's a message to carry. And if you want to be part of a community that refuses to let arrogance win, that celebrates dignity, justice, and resilience, then subscribe. Join us. Each story we tell isn't just about politics. It's about who we are and who we choose to be together. Because today, Pompeo's attack became Crockett's defining moment. And tomorrow, it could be yours.